Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channels. We try to build this bad boy up. Always appreciative of all the support. NFL Combine going on, NFL offseason in full swing. Matthew Stafford going back to the Rams. That's sort of the first quarterback domino to fall. You hear a lot of reports, things that get stirred up the week of the Combine, and one early on Friday morning that involves the Packers came out from Corbin Smith, who covers the Seahawks for a couple of different outlets. And on Friday morning, Smith reported that while the Seahawks are not, actively trying to trade DK Metcalf, they're listening, and that his sources are telling him the Packers have made an offer, a high-end draft pick and a young receiver of their own in return for DK Metcalf. Matt Schneidman of The Athletic, who covers the Packers, came out and said his source says there have been no talks, no dialogue. I think one thing you have to understand is, Schneidman's he's hit the nail on the head many times with his sources and reporting in years past. I would say, obviously his source comes from inside from the Packers side of things. And I think it'd be foolish for anyone in that building to tell a reporter who's, using them as a source that we're actively having conversations about DK Metcalf, to release that in February, the week of the Combine. It would just be bad business to do that, so I'm not surprised necessarily. I'm not saying Schneidman's lying whatsoever. I'm sure that's exactly what his source told him, but these organizations are going to look out for the best interest of themselves, and it just wouldn't be good business for the Packers to come out and fully say, you lose leverage when you're like, we're having talks about DK Metcalf. We're in active talks with Seattle. The report is interesting in and of itself, obviously, and pertains directly to Green Bay. So do I believe that there may have been some chit-chat between the Packers and the Seahawks about this? Sure, yeah, I believe that could have happened. We just have to see where it goes. I mean, there's so many different tentacles and angles to this. I don't think DK Metcalf... I don't think it's a 1A move at wide receiver for Green Bay. And here, there's a difference in being the top option with the Packers and being like a true alpha number one wideout. That's to me where I have where I see the difference in if the Packers were to acquire DK Metcalf. Because if you get Metcalf with how this team's currently assembled, and you have him on your depth chart, he is, without a doubt, the top wide receiver in that group, in that room for Green Bay. And at age 27 years old, DK is going to command one more really big contract, one would think. He's still posting great numbers. He rarely misses games. DK Metcalf has never missed more than 2 games in any season since he was drafted by Seattle back in 2019. He's incredibly durable. It's not impossible to suggest that DK's next contract, and again, he has 1 year left on his current deal, his next contract, he could see around $30 million annually on his deal. He's going to see well over $20 million as long as he has a good 2025 campaign, and he might have a contract extension in place before this season, whether it's with Seattle or a team that he's traded to or wherever he lands up. And you look at receivers who are making $30 million a year, you're talking Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and that's when you start to scratch your head a little bit, and you're like, is DK Metcalf really cut from that same cloth? Is he in the tier of a Tyreek Hill, who I know had a down year, but look at the bigger resume, and is he in the same tier, in the same class as an Amon-Ra St. Brown? And so those are the questions you have to start asking yourself. But the financial burden of it for Green Bay wouldn't be a problem. They have money to play with. They have money to spend this offseason. Now, you have to be careful with that, obviously. You don't want to go, blow it and spend it in the wrong ways. And I have no, worries that Green Bay would do that anyways. DK on the field, I mentioned he doesn't miss much time. 15 yards per reception last year, 27 receptions of throws that traveled 20-plus yards. He's a true deep threat. He'll take the lid off of defense. He would be what Christian Watson is for the Packers. And again, we know Watson's going to miss a significant amount of time in 2025 recovering from a torn ACL. But DK, and you love Christian Watson, but DK Metcalf's a more complete receiver, a more proven receiver, a more consistent receiver, numbers-wise, availability-wise, than what Watson has been for Green Bay. So that's why I say You bring Metcalf over, if a trade were to come to fruition, he is immediately the number one wideout on the depth chart for Green Bay. But he's not at least to me like a true dominant, no doubt, alpha top wide receiver. And in fact, if you look at the numbers this past season in Seattle, DK was second in targets, second in receptions, second in yards, second in touchdowns. 4 major categories: targets, receptions, yards, touchdowns. DK was not number one in any of those for the Seahawks. He was number 2 in every single one, behind Jackson Smith-Njigba, second-year wide receiver, first-round pick out of Ohio State for Seattle. So again, you break it apart and you say, yes, this guy would be the top option in Green Bay in the passing game for the wide receiver group. But if you trade for DK, and if you give up a first-round pick, and if you have to give up a young wide receiver like a Romeo Doubs or a Dontavian Wicks to get the deal done, you're not doing it for a one-year rental. It'd be under the premise and the idea that DK is going to get a long-term and extension worked out with the Packers. And so you'd be paying him, again, the market says it'd be right around $30 million a year. And so right now I think he's at like $24 million a year. He's a really good wide receiver. It wouldn't be a huge financial burden for Green Bay to fork up, if they had to, a deal of, let's say, 3 years, which gets him to age 30, 31, right around there, a 3-4 year deal, and have it annually average out to around $30 million a year for DK. Like, that wouldn't break the bank for Green Bay. But would it be a move that would take this offense and push it over the top? Because if you look around, and I brought this up, Green Bay has running back solved. Josh Jacobs is a monster. He can be a bell cow if he needs to be. I'm excited to see what Marshawn Lloyd looks like, a healthy Marshawn Lloyd. Remember, they used a third-round pick on Lloyd last year out of USC. Played like 8 snaps, multiple injuries, appendicitis at the end of the year. Pretty much lived on IR for Green Bay. You bring back Emmanuel Wilson. I like him as a number 2 while Lloyd sort of gets his feet wet. So you have running back solved. Offensive line's good. Offensive line's really good. You give Zach Tom a new deal, an extension that should be worked out this offseason. You solidify your right tackle. Questions at center if Josh Myers is back in the frame or not. But the offensive line's good. I love the tight end room led by Tucker Kraft. Need to see more out of Luke Musgrave. Maybe they make a move there, but Tucker Kraft's a really, really good tight end. Quarterback, Jordan Love, roller coaster ride of a season. Injuries, no doubt, played a part, but we're not going to give him that as like a crutch for everything. Love needs to be better. I believe he will be better than what we saw for a lot of the 2024 season. The wide receiver room is really where you see, mass inconsistencies, the ultimate roller coaster ride, and a lot of promise, a lot of untapped potential. But like, what is the ceiling for Jayden Reed? Is it a number 1 wideout? I don't know. I think you're really stretching it out if that's your ultimate belief. What's the ceiling for Romeo Doubs? Can he be a number 1 wide receiver, or is he better suited as a 2 or a 3? What about Watson when he's healthy? What about Dontavian Wicks? There's a lot of question marks that haven't been resolved, that we haven't had solutions for in Green Bay. And so if you bring in a really good wideout, if you bring in a DK Metcalf, it enhances that room. It enhances the offense. Does it push it over the top? And if Green Bay thinks it does, then you look at the compensation you're giving up. To me, a first-round pick and one of your own young wide receivers, and I think the names I saw floated out were Doubs and Dontavian Wicks. Seattle's not going to trade for Christian Watson. Not when he's injured and he's nearing the end of his rookie deal. He's on the same timeline, same path as Romeo Doubs, but he's going to miss significant time in 2025. So he's out of the equation. Jayden Reed, to me, he's a year later when his contract will expire compared to Doubs and Watson. He's right on the same timeline as Wicks. But with Reed, you really saw the promise in the first month of the season where there was a point in time, 3-4 weeks in, where I was like, whoa, Jayden Reed might be the top dog in this wide receiver room. And then his, that word I bring up all the time with a lot of these guys, consistency just dwindled, and Jayden Reed was invisible for some games down the stretch run of the season for the Packers. I can't see them trading a first and Reed for DK Metcalf. And so when you look at the compensation for this, I mentioned like Metcalf's not Justin Jefferson. He's not Jamar Chase. He's not CeeDee Lamb. In those type of wideouts, they don't come around every year. They don't show up with much frequency, and that's a credit to Jefferson, Chase, Lamb, some of these other guys. I think Malik Neighbors will be a name that we include with that group of just clear-cut, top-tier wide receivers. If you didn't have to part with a first-rounder and a young wide receiver, which, again, is just the reported compensation, and I believe that Corbin Smith reported that his source said Green Bay would be open to including the number 23 overall pick. I have a hard time believing that. I don't have any sources, that would say one way or another, obviously. Just knowing Goody in this front office and how much they value draft picks, you telling me they give up number 23 and Dobbs or Wicks for DK Metcalf? And Metcalf's good, again, but he's not Chase. He's not Jefferson. He's not CeeDee Lamb. He's a tier or two below that, which is fine. He's still a really good wide receiver. But it's hard to cross-compare when you have different positions. But most everyone has said, hey, Myles Garrett wants out of Cleveland. Cleveland doesn't want to trade Myles Garrett. They're going to have to face reality at some point. They're going to have to get rid of Myles Garrett. And the reported asking price where people think it would land at for Myles Garrett would be 2 first-round picks. A lot of teams, I think, would give up 2 first-round picks for Myles Garrett. He is at the top of his class at his position. He can single-handedly take over a game in stretches as a pass rusher. He has shown it time and again. He is one of, if not the best, edge rushers in the National Football League. It's him, it's TJ Watt, it's Max Crosby, Micah Parsons. Myles Garrett, you could easily make a case, is the best edge rusher in the NFL. And again, it's hard to cross-compare positions. But if you're telling me at a spot where teams are starving and salivating at the idea of having a Myles Garrett, and most believe that it should be around 2 first-round picks to get a deal done, and then you pivot and look at DK and you're like, well, Green Bay would have to give up its first and a young wide receiver, not 2 first, but that just seems a little rich. If you're telling me it'd be, I'm trying to think of something that I believe would be even. Like if Seattle's hell-bent on adding Dobbs or Dontavian Wicks, let's just say that has to be part of the equation for them in this hypothetical. To me, a 3rd-round pick with Dobbs or Wicks, not Dobbs and Wicks, would be way more reasonable. Like, if the reports weren't that number 23 overall pick, if Green Bay could land DK Metcalf and keep its number 23 overall pick, then I'm way more inclined to hear you out. Then I'm like, okay, because you can still get another piece at 23, not necessarily a wide receiver, but you keep that flexibility, you keep that first-round pick, but you also get DK Metcalf, and then you give him that extension. I'd be way more open-minded to hearing out that particular deal if those were the numbers, if those were the picks involved. First-rounder plus a young wideout just seems like a lot for, again, a guy who's always available, has never missed more than 2 games, is an incredible deep threat. I mentioned it, 15 yards per reception, 27 receptions, where the ball traveled 20-plus yards last year alone. Like DK Metcalf, puts some fear into a defensive coordinator when they're planning for Seattle's offense. But it was a guy who, he wasn't first in targets. He wasn't first in receptions. He wasn't first in yards. He wasn't first in touchdowns for the Seahawks last year. That went to Smith-Njigba, who's an emerging young star in the NFL. And so, again, Metcalf would be the top option in Green Bay, but you'd be giving up a premium draft pick and a really good young wide receiver for a guy who's going to be the best in your room, but he's not a consistent game changer. If you talk about giving up a first and one of your own wideouts, to me, you should be getting back more than DK Metcalf. And it sounds like a knock on DK. It's not meant to be that. And I know a lot of people will hear me say this and they're like, well, what's a better option? I've already brought it to the table what I think would be the best option for Green Bay which should be its 1A move at wide receiver this offseason. And some have scoffed at it. I get it. To me, it's Davante Adams. And if you get Davante Adams, it's not going to be $30 million a year. That's what the market will bear out in all likelihood for DK on his next extension, which he will get either in Seattle or with someone else. Assuming if it's not done this year, and he is in a contract year, as long as he puts up the numbers he's posted and is as available as he's been since coming into the league in 2019, that's around where his number will be. Davante Adams isn't going to be $30 million a year. Davante Adams, you're not going to have to give up picks. You're not going to have to give up a young wide receiver. The Jets are just going to release him. And I do think the Stafford move by him staying in Los Angeles matters for Green Bay, because there had been reports that if Aaron Rodgers ends up on the West Coast, Davante might follow suit and go with Rodgers. Well, the Chargers have Herbert. He's not going anywhere. The Raiders are more likely to draft a quarterback. They had Davante. They traded him. Why would Davante go back to the Raiders even if Rodgers is there? It doesn't make sense. The Rams now have Stafford. And so you're running out of options on the West Coast. Those are the options on the West Coast. And so Rodgers is going to have to pivot. I saw reports that the Giants could come knocking and potentially go for Rodgers. The Stafford move to stay in LA, Rodgers to the LA Rams was a possibility if Stafford went elsewhere, if Stafford went to the Raiders or if Stafford went to the Giants. So that takes one less, potential landing spot for Davante if he wanted to follow Rodgers, if Rodgers ended up on the West Coast. My move is Davante. That's what I would want. You wouldn't have to give up draft compensation. You wouldn't have to give up a young wide receiver. It's not going to break the bank, and DK wouldn't break the bank at $30 million a year, but it's not going to cost you that. And I just think it lines up perfectly. You listen to Goody talk at the Combine in his end of the year presser in January. He still believes that there is a possibility that one of these four young wideouts, Wicks, Dobbs, Watson, Reed, that he believes at least one of them could eventually be a true number one wide receiver. I think time's running out for that. He still believes it. What better way to still massage that idea than to bring in Davante Adams for 2 years? To me, that's a move that indicates everything Goody said back in January. It's time to compete for championships now. Look at Davante's numbers. I know he's in his early 30s. He's still producing at an incredible level. Davante is still an alpha number one wide receiver. Is he a Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb? Well, age-wise, no. Is he in the prime of his career? He's at the end of that now. But Davante Adams is still an absolute number one wide receiver that wouldn't cost you draft compensation, that wouldn't cost you $30 million a year. You can bring him in. Goody gets the best of both worlds. You get your clear-cut number one option in Green Bay for a couple of years to show that, hey, what did Goody say in January? It's time to start competing for championships. Bringing in Davante is a move that you're showing it's time to start competing for championships. But you also get that reassurance that, hey, Davante is only going to be, he'd only be in Green Bay for probably 2 years, 3 at an absolute max. And while he's your go-to option, he is the guy for Jordan Love, and it would alleviate a hell of a lot of pressure in the passing game. It would also give those 4 young guys that Goody still heavily believes in, that a lot of us still believe in, more time to sort of try to figure things out and see if one of those guys can emerge as a true number one. And if they do, by the time Davante's deal runs up with Green Bay, if it's 2 years, assuming that's where it would be, then they step into that spotlight. To me, I think with everything Goody has said this offseason, it's time to compete for championships. Talking about a window, he doesn't typically do that. And there being a clear need for a number one wide receiver, whether you want to admit it or not, DK Metcalf would be great. I wouldn't be pissed off if the Packers traded for DK Metcalf. I would be very, very surprised if they did so and gave up the number 23 overall pick and one of its own young wide receivers. You can get the number one wide receiver label, a true alpha, with Davante Adams, and it wouldn't cost as much and you wouldn't have to give up draft compensation. That, to me, is the 1A move that I would like to see the Packers make it wide out. But the rumblings, at least on Friday morning, are surrounding DK Metcalf. So we'll see if anything comes to fruition. I doubt it'd be anytime, soon, but who knows? It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Always appreciate all the support. Please click that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.